This is Eric Strong from Stanford University. In this video, I'll be discussing cardiac auscultation. Please note that this is an abridged version of two separate videos on heart sounds and heart murmurs. For anyone looking for a particularly in-depth discussion of this topic, you may want to consider viewing those videos instead. The specific learning objectives of this video is to describe the basic physiology behind the generation of abnormal heart sounds and murmurs, to characterize the acoustical properties of heart sounds and murmurs using standardized terminology, and to identify the most likely underlying cardiac pathology based upon the characteristics of these abnormalities. I'm going to start off right at the beginning by stating that hearing abnormal heart sounds is difficult. Mastery in auscultation requires three things. First and foremost, practice and experience, but also knowledge of cardiac physiology, and finally, a naturally good ear. A good ear is an English language idiom meaning an inherent ability to understand, interpret, and describe sounds. If you're a trainee at the moment, you may have noticed that some people in your class seem to pick up on cardiac auscultation more naturally than others. Some of this may be due to practice outside of class, but a large component is likely due to who has a good ear and who does not. Deliberate practice can partially overcome a lack of this natural skill, but it will be more difficult and require more practice and experience. In addition to practice, my other biggest piece of advice for trainees who are still struggling with auscultation is to be sure to spend a lot of time listening to the individual patient's heart. When doing so, first identify which part is systole and which is diastole, and then listen to each component of the cardiac cycle separately for as long as necessary in order to feel confident of what one hears. You will often see your superiors doing very cursory auscultation where only a few seconds is spent with a stethoscope on the patient's chest wall. Please do not let that be your model. Normally, there are two heart sounds. S1 occurs at the closing of the mitral and tricuspid valve at the transition from diastole to systole, and S2 occurs at the closing of the aortic and pulmonic valves at the transition from systole to diastole. When it comes to S1, it's a relatively high-pitched sound. Its intensity is predominantly determined by its mitral valve component, so thus S1 is usually loudest at the apex. The intensity or loudness of S1 is related to the speed with which the mitral valve closes. S2 is relatively high to moderately high-pitched. It's easiest to hear at the upper sternal border. And S2 is normally split during inspiration. What does that mean? So here's a schematic of what these sounds look like. Imagine that the x-axis here is time and the y-axis is intensity of sound. During both expiration and inspiration, S1 is usually a single sound. Regarding S2, during expiration, the aortic and pulmonic contributions to S2, designated A2 and P2, occur simultaneously, resulting in a single fused sound we know as S2. However, during inspiration, changing intrathoracic pressure and alterations in right and left ventricular preload result in A2 occurring slightly earlier and P2 occurring slightly later. Therefore, S2 is split into two separate and distinct sounds, with the normal separation being just wide enough for most people to appreciate when auscultating in a quiet room. As the schematic suggests, the aortic component of the split S2 is usually louder than the pulmonic component. Take a listen to normal heart sounds through the respiratory cycle, paying particular attention to the splitting of S2 during inspiration. There are many abnormalities of the S2 split, and each abnormality has a list of specific etiologies. For example, S2 can be so-called widely split, in which the A2 and P2 are mildly split in expiration, with a more prominent split during inspiration. There can be a fixed split, in which A2 and P2 are equally split throughout the respiratory cycle. And I won't go through the rest here, but you can pause the video and copy all of this down if you like. In general, in the era of rapidly available EKGs and echocardiograms, the utility of mastering identification of these subtle abnormalities is honestly somewhat low. This is particularly given the fact that the sensitivity and specificity of these abnormalities is generally not known, and they are very subtle findings to pick up. There are certainly exceptions to this. For example, I know of at least one trainee who picked up a completely asymptomatic ASD by first identifying a fixed split S2. And there is also one particular abnormality of S2 which in my personal experience is more helpful than the others. It's this one, an unusually loud P2 that is a pulmonic component of the S2, which is suggestive of pulmonary hypertension and in fact particularly severe pulmonary hypertension. Take a listen to what this sounds like. So far, what I've been discussing is normal sounds and abnormalities of these normal sounds. Now I'm going to move on to discuss those sounds whose very existence is abnormal. There are a lot of them. There are sounds due to an abnormal ventricle, such as S3 and S4. There are sounds due to abnormal valves, such as various clicks and snaps. There is the pericardial knock of pericarditis. And finally, the unfortunately named tumor plop due to an atrial myxoma intermittently flopping down in front of the mitral or tricuspid valve. For this video, I'm just going to focus on the S3 and S4. S3 is a low-pitched early diastolic sound. Theoretically, it should be easier to hear with the bell of the stethoscope than with its diaphragm, though I find that distinction to be very subtle in stethoscopes of the non-digital variety. S3 is easiest to hear at the apex with a patient in the left lateral decubitus position. Although it is occasionally heard in young healthy people and in pregnant women, in those over the age of 40, it is usually pathologic and indicative of left ventricular failure. The actual mechanism of generation is not completely known. Take a listen to a recording of a patient with an S3 and appreciate the overlapping coming and going of the split S2. S4 is a low-pitched, late diastolic sound. It is sometimes referred to as a pre-systolic sound. Unlike S3, the presence of an S4 is considered to always be pathologic. It's thought to be caused by atrial contraction into a stiff and non-compliant ventricle. However, it has been described in patients with atrial fibrillation and atrial flutter who necessarily lack atrial contraction, thus calling this mechanism into question. Take a listen to a patient with S4. There is an etiological distinction that I've heard drawn on the wards between S3 and S4, whereby an S3 is considered indicative of left ventricular volume overload, and S4 is considered indicative of left ventricular pressure overload. However, since pressure and volume are tightly linked, this distinction doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think it's probably best to consider S3 more indicative of systolic dysfunction, and S4 more indicative of diastolic dysfunction, though even this may be an oversimplification. Now let's talk about heart murmurs. Heart murmurs are prolonged sounds caused by turbulent blood flow. There are many different etiologies of murmurs, which can be distinguished from one another based upon the murmur's specific characteristics. There are 7 characteristics to consider, In rough order of importance, they are timing, location and radiation, shape, pitch, intensity, quality, and response to maneuvers. I'll explain each one at a time. First up is timing. The most common murmurs are systolic. Examples of etiologies leading to systolic murmurs are aortic and pulmonic stenosis, mitral and tricuspid regurgitation, ventricular septal defects, and something called a flow murmur. A flow murmur is essentially any murmur caused by something other than intrinsic cardiac pathology. For example, a murmur caused by the excessively vigorous expelling of blood through a normal aortic valve in patients with hyperdynamic states like sepsis or hyperthyroidism. Flow murmurs can also occur in anemia, in which low blood viscosity increases the probability of turbulent flow. When it comes to diastolic murmurs, by a huge margin, the most common cause is aortic regurgitation, but diastolic murmurs can also be caused by pulmonic regurgitation, as well as mitral and tricuspid stenosis. Finally, there is a rarely heard continuous murmur, which is heard in both parts of the cardiac cycle, in infants and children with a patent ductus arteriosus. In adults, when a continuous murmur seems to be present, it is almost always the result of separate systolic and diastolic murmurs being superimposed on one another. For example, in a patient with combined aortic stenosis and aortic regurgitation. The characteristic next in importance in securing an accurate diagnosis is the location and radiation. Historically, murmurs were described in medical school classes based upon whether they were heard best in the so-called aortic, pulmonic, tricuspid, or mitral areas. These are the 4 spots on the chest wall which best line up with where those valves sit inside, and are thus the 4 spots where clinicians typically auscultate. Thus, a physician or nurse might describe a murmur in the, quote, aortic area. There's a big problem with this practice. In reality, the location where murmurs are best heard does not always line up neatly with the causative valve. For example, aortic valve disease can be best heard almost anywhere in the chest. As a consequence, to prevent inaccurate or presumptive conclusions about the etiology of a murmur, it is always preferable to describe the location of a murmur based upon surface anatomy. For example, instead of reporting a murmur loudest in the aortic area, report it as loudest in the second right intercostal space. Closely related to location is whether the sound radiates. Radiation is best thought of as another location, one not directly over the heart, where the murmur is audible. In general, murmurs radiate in the same direction as the turbulent blood is flowing. So in aortic stenosis, the turbulent blood is flowing superiorly out of the left ventricle and into the aorta, so aortic stenosis murmurs classically radiate to the carotid arteries. The regurgitant blood flow in mitral regurg travels backwards and superiorly, so it's sometimes heard radiating to the left axilla, and tricuspid regurgitation can on rare occasions radiate to the right anterior chest wall. The shape of a murmur is perhaps the most frustrating of characteristics for a trainee to appreciate, and the one in which having a naturally good ear is the most helpful. The shape describes how murmur intensity changes from onset to completion. There are 3 basic shapes: crescendo-decrescendo, which means it first grows louder and then softer; decrescendo, in which it starts loud at the very beginning and then tapers off; and uniform, also called holosystolic when occurring in systole. Uniform murmurs are the same volume for their entire duration. The shape of a murmur is generally determined by the pattern of the pressure gradient driving the turbulent flow. The shape of murmurs will make a lot more sense by looking at some pressure tracings in various valvular disease and listening to paired examples. So first, consider this intercardiac pressure tracing with pressure from the left ventricle, left atrium, and aorta graphed as a function of time. In this particular example, you'll notice that a significant pressure gradient exists between the LV and the aorta during systole. Of course, that's not normal, and in this case, it's the result of aortic stenosis. Now consider the magnitude of the pressure gradient at different parts of the systole. Early in systole, the pressure gradient is relatively small. In mid-systole, it's relatively large. and in late systole it's small again. This corresponds beautifully with the typical crescendo-decrescendo shape of aortic stenosis. It starts quietly, then gets louder, and then softer again. Of course, even at the slow rate of 60 beats per minute, systole occupies only about 350 to 400 milliseconds, so you can imagine that the getting loud and soft aspect of it happens very quick. Listen to what it sounds like. And compare that to mitral regurgitation. In MR, there is also a pressure gradient during systole, but in this case it is between the LV and LA, and the magnitude of the gradient is essentially constant throughout systole. Thus, MR murmurs are typically uniform. Listen to the difference. The very astute viewer might point out here that the pressure gradient in MR actually isn't constant, but does have a very brief ramping up period and very brief ramping down period. And that's true, and you would expect that to produce a crescendo-decrescendo effect of some kind. However, the duration of time over which the loudness of the murmur is increasing or decreasing is so brief it cannot be perceived by the ear. In aortic regurgitation, there is a gradient between the aorta and left ventricle during diastole. As diastole progresses and more blood falls backwards into the left ventricle, aortic pressure drops as LV pressure slightly increases, resulting in a narrowing of the pressure gradient. Thus, this leads to a diastolic decrescendo murmur. Here's the last valve example, mitral stenosis, in which a gradient exists between the left ventricle and left atrium during diastole. Note that the gradient is fairly constant up until a brief bump just before the onset of systole, which corresponds to atrial contraction. Here's the shape of that murmur, which is often described as uniform with presystolic accentuation. When the mitral stenosis is only mild, occasionally the murmur has more of a decrescendo shape with presystolic accentuation, because the pressures in the left atrium and left ventricle can equalize up until atrial contraction. Take a listen to the uniform murmur of severe MS. Before moving on to the next characteristic, I wanted to mention one more shape variant and common point of confusion. There are two general variations of the systolic crescendo-decrescendo murmur. I've already shown and played for you the more classic one, in which the peak intensity of the murmur occurs in the middle of systole, as in the specific audio clip, or latent systole. This is typical of aortic stenosis and is predictably referred to as a mid or a late peaking systolic crescendo-decrescendo murmur. To contrast that, here's an example of an early peaking systolic murmur that you might hear with anemia or hyperdynamic state like sepsis. In most cases, not only does the murmur peak early, but it also ends well before S2. Although early peaking murmurs like this one are not as discussed in school or entry-level textbooks, in practice they are actually more common. The easiest way to tell the difference between mid to late peaking versus early peaking, once you've identified the murmur as crescendo-decrescendo in shape, is to focus on S2. In mid and late peaking murmurs like that from AS, S2 gets relatively obscured by the murmur and is harder to hear, while in early peaking murmurs, S2 is easy to identify. So let me play the AS murmur again so that you can appreciate how hard it is to hear S2. and then hear a typical early peaking murmur in a patient with anemia. S2 here is much more clear. The next characteristic is pitch, which is another name for the relative frequency of the murmur. High pressure gradients, for example ventricular septal defects, tend to produce high-pitched murmurs. A large volume of blood flowing across a low pressure gradient, such as mitral stenosis, tends to produce low-pitched murmurs. And when blood flow is both being driven by a high pressure gradient and consists of a large volume, as is seen with aortic stenosis, there are simultaneously produced high and low pitches. The way our brain perceives this scenario is that the pitch subjectively sounds high, but the quality of the sound is very harsh. Take a listen to 3 examples of different pitches, paying particular attention to the harshness of a typical aortic stenosis murmur. Although it is one of the most consistently reported characteristics of a murmur, the intensity, or overall loudness, is one of the less helpful, largely because it is so subjective. Intensity is usually graded on a scale from 1 to 6, and for some historical reason I don't know, Roman numerals are typically used here. Grade 1 means it's barely audible. Grade 2 is soft but easily heard. Grade 3 is very loud. Grade 4 is associated with a thrill, which is a palpable vibration on the chest wall caused by the sound waves. The closest comparison to a thrill is a very subtle version of what a cat feels like when it's purring. With a grade 5 murmur, the murmur is audible with the stethoscope only partly in contact with the chest wall, for example if it's resting on its side. And grade 6 murmurs are audible without a stethoscope at all, just by putting one's ear close to the chest. Obviously, this scale is highly subjective and depends as much on the hearing of the examiner, quality of the stethoscope, and the ambient room noise as it does on the murmur itself. Another characteristic, which is usually not terribly helpful, with one exception, is the quality of a murmur. By quality, I'm referring to the subjective timbre or color of the sound, a highly subjective and difficult to quantitatively define aspect. Different pathological problems classically lead to murmurs with specific qualities. For example, MR murmurs are often described as blowing or musical. Mitral stenosis murmurs are described as rumbling. AS murmurs, as noted a minute ago, are harsh. AR murmurs are blowing. There is a benign systolic murmur in childhood known as Still's murmur, which is described as musical or vibratory. And finally, the continuous murmur of a patent ductus arteriosus is described as machine-like. In practice, at least in the adult population, the only valvular lesion whose quality I've found to be helpful is the harshness of AS, which helps to distinguish it from MR in situations where the murmur shape is unclear. Finally, the last characteristic is a murmur's response to certain physical maneuvers. This is known formally as dynamic auscultation. The examiner listens to the patient at rest or in a certain position, and then asks the patient to do something like stand up suddenly, or take a deep breath in, or perform a Valsalva maneuver. The examiner then assesses how the murmur's intensity changed in response to the subsequent transient change in hemodynamics. The differences when present are usually subtle. There are many examples of how dynamic auscultation can help with diagnosis. I've listed at last among the murmur characteristics, not because it's the least helpful, but rather because it is a high-level specialized skill that may be best reserved for those clinicians and students who have already mastered the preceding characteristics. As just one example, asking a patient to clench their fists will increase afterload. Increasing afterload will help to distinguish mitral regurgitation from aortic stenosis. In MR, with higher afterload, more blood will preferentially go backwards through the mitral valve during systole, and therefore the murmur's intensity can be increased. While in AS, the murmur is either slightly diminished or unchanged. Once again, these changes in intensity are very subtle, and overall, assessing a murmur's response to maneuvers is an advanced skill which would not normally be expected of a medical student. I'm going to end the video here with two terms related to murmurs of which you should be cautious. And the reason you should be cautious is because these terms are misused by trainees and even senior physicians all the time. First is ejection murmur. The term ejection murmur specifically refers to a murmur that is produced by blood flowing forward through the aortic or pulmonic valve during systole. They can either be pathologic or benign, and can be the result of either primary valvular pathology or an example of the next term, a flow murmur. Now, I've already mentioned a flow murmur earlier in the video as a murmur that's produced by blood flowing forward through a morphologically normal valve, in which the cause of the turbulent flow is either an increased velocity of flow from hyperdynamic state or decreased viscosity from anemia. But please keep in mind that these two terms, ejection murmur and flow murmur, it's very, very common to hear these misused on the wards, and if you do use them in presentations or in written notes, please be sure that you're using the terms accurately. So to summarize the examination of murmurs, you should try to describe them using as many characteristics as possible. For example, one hypothetical murmur might be described as a, quote, harsh 3 out of 6 systolic crescendo-decrescendo murmur best heard at the second right intercostal space and radiating to the carotids. Or alternatively, another murmur might be described as a, quote, blowing 2 out of 6 diastolic decrescendo murmur best heard at the left lower sternal border and without radiation. That concludes this abridged overview of cardiac auscultation. If you found it helpful, please remember to like it and share it. And please feel free to check out my other videos on heart sounds and murmurs if you want more details. In particular, the link on the screen below will take you to the last third of the complete heart murmurs video, in which I present multiple unknown heart murmurs and give you the opportunity to describe them and attempt to identify the most likely underlying cardiac pathology.